Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a bit of a different video. So I really wanted to do a couple of Halloween-y videos this year, and I thought what better way to discuss Halloween than by surrounding a video around one of my favorite Halloween creatures, which is the vampire. The vampire is easily my favorite creature of all time, my favorite horror creature, and my favorite romantic creature. And so I kind of went for a theme today. We're in the Halloween setting, we're in the Halloween look, and I decided I wanted to discuss vampires through a very particular lens, and that lens is the romantic movement. And this is where I think we can really see the roots of the modern vampire coming forward. It's around the time of the romantic movement in the late 1700s and early 1800s that the vampire morphs from a creature of folk tale into what we now associate with vampires, kind of a more romantic figure, and maybe even more of a darkly sexy figure that's not necessarily a monster. So recently I have read 3 vampiric poems and novellas, there's only one novella, that surround vampires that are from the Romantic era. And so I thought I would go through these chronologically, and some of these are far more overt and others are not. So the first that we're going to discuss today is Christabel by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And this is a narrative poem that was always intended to be much longer. He intended to have a couple of extra parts published, but they were never written, so technically Christabel is an unfinished poem. And the first part was published in 1797, the second part was published in 1800. Now, Christabel is a name I have always heard. I've heard of a lot of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poems, but Christabel and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner are probably the two I've heard the most about. So it's interesting to me that when I really wanted to look up things about Christabel, that I didn't find very much, that people seem to think this was one of his less popular poems. But essentially what Christabel is about a girl named Christabel who stumbles across a woman called Geraldine who claims she has been abducted on horseback by a group of men. And so Christabel kind of takes pity on her and says she will bring her home. And along the way, there are very many signs that things are not all right, that Geraldine is perhaps not a normal woman. So some of those signs are like dogs bark at her. Dogs are uncomfortable around her. She can't pass through an iron gate, which is perhaps the biggest sign that something is not right. And once she arrives back at Christabel's home, she sets about really enamoring everyone around her, particularly Christabel's father. And Christabel is starting to feel like things are not okay, and maybe Geraldine is not all she seems, but she is apparently the only person who is picking up on all of this weird stuff surrounding Geraldine. So this is a poem that I would say is not overtly about vampires, but you can easily pick up on signs based on kind of the old folklore stories about vampires. And Christabel, I think, will be a very familiar setup to you if you have read Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, or you're familiar with any of the adaptations of that about a female vampire. That's very much present in Christabel, and the tension between Christabel and Geraldine is very similar. It makes you feel a little bit like J. Sheridan Le Fanu must have been influenced by Christabel, and perhaps he was. And I think had the poem been finished, had there been those parts added to it that Samuel Taylor Coleridge really wanted, I think that we would have seen vampire more plainly on the page. Now, Christabel is written in a really interesting metrical style. It's very unique, or it was very unique at the time, and I think it makes it a really fun read and a really lyrical read, and I'm a big advocate for this. If you read Christabel, I think you should read it aloud. And I'd say that for all poetry. I really like reading aloud in general, but as I've been discovering the Romantics this year, I think that's been a large part of why I've really enjoyed them, is that I have tried my hardest to always read the works out loud, which does take a little bit longer and may mean that you stay with the poem for a little bit longer than you would like, but I think it does add to the atmosphere of it, and certainly in Christabel's case, it adds a little bit of creepiness to it, especially if you were reading it at night. So this is one that I don't think really on the face of it may tell you this is about a vampire, but I think if you are familiar with things like Carmilla, you can definitely see that's probably what he was going for. And the interesting thing about this to me is, I'm not sure if this is the first instance of it regarding a vampire. I'm sure it's not. It's certainly in the old folk tales, but I thought this is a really interesting instance of hypnotism, and that's a very iconic power of the vampire, is kind of to glamour you or compel you. And yes, I'm using terms from True Blood and the Vampire Diaries, but what else could I do? We're talking about vampires, so we need to talk about the greatest of them, in my opinion. But there's always a vampire who can kind of make you do what they want. That seems to be a really modern power that we give to vampires that doesn't seem as though it should have been rooted in classic lit at all. But it was present to a certain extent in Dracula, and it's also very much present here in Christabel. So I highly encourage you to read Christabel. It's very short to be a narrative poem because he did intend it to be much longer, so it's certainly one that you can read in a sitting. The next poem I wanted to discuss is the Giaour by Lord Byron, and I have never been quite sure whether or not I am saying this correctly. It is spelled Giaour, and so part of me wants to say Giaour, but I have been told that it is to be pronounced Giaour because it is a Turkish term. And so this is a Turkish set narrative poem, and it was published in 1813, so a good while after Christabel, but Lord Byron was inspired to write this when he was on his grand tour and he went through Greece, and he heard a very particular story about a tradition in Turkey where you would drown an adulterous woman by putting her in a sack and throwing her in the ocean. And so that's very largely the theme of the Giaour. It is a narrative poem told through 3 points of view, but it mainly follows one storyline about a woman called Layla who is in a man named Hassan's harem, and she has fallen in love with the Giaour, and because of that, Hassan has her drowned. Now, one of the other narrators predicts that Hassan himself will be punished for doing this, and the way in which he will be punished is that he will be turned into a vampire. He will feed on the blood of his family. That will be horrible to him and them both. And so this has a very overt passage in it discussing vampires that I think is really wonderful, so I'm going to read it to you. This is from lines about 757 to about 765 in my edition of the Giaour. But first on earth as vampires sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. There from thy daughter, sister, wife, at midnight drain the stream of life, yet loathe the banquet which perforce must feed thy livid living course. Thy victims, ere they yet expire, shall know the demon for their sire. As cursing thee, thou cursing them, thy flowers are withered on the stem. So my edition also includes some notes that Byron wrote himself on his own poetry, and so he does make some notes on the vampire and the tradition of the vampire. He says the vampire superstition is still general in the Levant. The Greeks never mentioned the word without horror. I recollect a whole family being terrified by the scream of a child, which they imagine must proceed from such a visitation. The freshness of the face and the wetness of the lip with blood are the never-failing signs of a vampire. The stories told in Hungary and Greece of these foul feeders are singular, and some of them most incredibly attested. So I think the really interesting thing here is that that section talking about vampires feels very modern. It feels as if he could be talking about, hey, a vampire that was on True Blood, or the Vampire Diaries, or Anne Rice. It doesn't feel as though it's totally the kind of empty-headed monster of folklore. The interesting thing about vampires is that they have always been around in folklore, but In a lot of cases in folklore stories, they seem to come across a bit more like zombies, a bit as if they don't really have much in terms of a thought process. They set out to attack their own family in a lot of these stories. And so that's present here, of course. That's definitely the major theme of this vampire and this vampire's curse, and that he's going to be cursed for having done something wrong in his life. But the use of the word sire really stuck out to me, and I don't think he meant it in the way that we now interpret sires with vampires. A lot of times in vampire fiction now, you will hear the term sire to mean the vampire who created you, the vampire who bit you and turned you into a vampire. That's your sire. And that's always a really interesting relationship to explore in vampire fiction. And I don't think it's necessarily meant that way here in this piece, because he does say, you know, they will know this demon is their sire, is kind of the line, horribly paraphrased. But I don't think he's turning them into vampires. I think he's just killing them. But I thought it was interesting to use that word. And so I'm now curious whether or not this is maybe the first instance the word sire was associated with vampires. If so, that's really interesting. If not, I would like to know where the first instance and association of the word sire with vampires came from. I really loved this. I have to say, of the three that I'm talking about today, the Giaour is my favorite. I think largely because I just love Lord Byron, and I've loved everything I've read from Lord Byron so far. It is stunningly beautiful. His meter is really wonderful, and there's a lot of rhyming in it, which of course makes it very, very charming. And that's another one of the reasons why I think reading poetry aloud can be quite fun and really enjoyable. But the Giaour is a much longer poem than Christabel, and so it might take you a little time to get through, but I really enjoyed it. I liked the storyline of it. It is not in any way, shape, or form Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And so when you read about this in the publication of the Giaour, it kind of took off, I think, basically because Childe Harold's first two cantos had come out and they were extremely, extremely popular. And this is when Lord Byron's name really took off. And so people were really interested in the Giaour because it was written by the author of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And it's wonderful. I mean, it really is very good. But if you read Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, you will just be utterly blown away. I think you will recognize the Giaour is good, but it is not at all on the caliber of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is potentially in my top 3 favorite poems of all time, which is really saying something. This is probably my highest recommend of all of those on my list to discuss today. I just love Lord Byron. I really liked the storyline here. I found it very interesting. There is, of course, far more to the Giaour than just this kind of one-off vampire connection. It is really discussing in a very interesting way kind of Christian versus Muslim ideas about love, religion, the afterlife. And Giaour is actually a term in Turkish for a non-believer, if I am not mistaken. And so there's a whole lot more going on than just the vampire connection or even the story with Layla. I think it's playing with a lot of really interesting themes, and these are themes that really appeal to Lord Byron and show up in multiple of his works. But the Giaour is not Lord Byron's only connection to vampires. So last but not least, we will talk about the most famous romantic vampire outing, and that is The Vampyre by Dr. John Polidori. And this is a really, really interesting work. And I say interesting because I don't want to tell you that it's fantastic, because it is not. The Vampyre wants to do a whole lot, but it wants to do it in a very short amount of time. And I think had this been a full-blown novel, it would be an amazing, amazing classic. And it still is an amazing classic, because this is really where the modern-day vampire is born, is in Dr. John Polidori's work. So this was published in 1819. It is the latest of these 3, and it was created on the same night that Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein, when Lord Byron challenged everyone at this house in Switzerland to write a ghost story. Dr. John Polidori was Lord Byron's personal physician, and he came up with this story. And there is a lot about this story that echoes other romantic works and romantic figures. So the main bare bones story of The Vampyre is that a man named Aubrey meets a man named Lord Ruthven. And Lord Ruthven is a really interesting, charismatic, kind of debauched aristocrat. And he travels with Aubrey on his kind of grand tour. They go to Rome, they go to Greece. And while in Greece especially, Aubrey forms a connection with a young woman, and things seem to go very weird very quickly. And Lord Ruthven is fatally injured. You assume he is fatally injured. Aubrey assumes he is fatally injured, and he is sworn on his deathbed. Lord Ruthven swears him on his deathbed. It says, please don't tell anyone about this. And Aubrey's like, okay, you're gonna be dead. I don't get it. When Aubrey arrives back in England, Lord Ruthven is there, and he's not dead. He's not dead at all, but Lord Ruthven reminds him, hey, you swore me an oath, so you better not say anything. And so unfortunately, Lord Ruthven marries Aubrey's sister. Aubrey can do nothing about this, though he now knows exactly what Lord Ruthven is after some mysterious deaths occurred while they were in Greece. And so Aubrey's sister becomes a victim of Lord Ruthven, and Lord Ruthven disappears after this. She's found drained of her blood entirely. And so this is, you might can imagine, the birth of the kind of aristocratic vampire. And so the interesting thing is, talking about parallels to real life, most people believe Lord Ruthven is meant to be Lord Byron. There are many, many reasons for this, because there are other characters in the narrative who echo people in Lord Byron's real life, especially Lady Caroline Lamb, which is interesting because Lady Caroline Lamb wrote her own novel about Lord Byron and called him Ruthven in that narrative. So it's clear that Dr. Polidori wanted you to make the association between Ruthven and Lord Byron, and this is really irritating to Lord Byron because on its publication, most people credit it to Lord Byron because it is so very much like him. Lord Byron hates this, he really detests this, but it is having his name slammed on the cover that makes the Vampyre take off. It was an instant bestseller. And so Dr. Polidori fought for a little while to get his name attached to the work. And eventually it was, but the popularity likely came initially because people thought, hey, this is the writer of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, I'm going to read it. And because it was an instant bestseller, it really changed people's perspective on vampires in general. And so this is really the instance that we can pinpoint where vampires move out of the realm of folklore and stories and into the realm of the modern day vampire, what we think of as a vampire, an aristocrat, a good-looking guy, somebody who's a little bit suave and a little bit dangerous. And so you definitely feel throughout this work, Aubrey has an attraction to Lord Ruthven as well, and Aubrey is, of course, I think, meant to kind of equate back to Dr. Polidori himself and some of his early feelings for Lord Byron. Dr. Polidori and Lord Byron had a very, very contentious friendship. I don't even know if you can call it a friendship because they just went through a lot together and really at the end of the day came to highly dislike one another. But we have a lot to credit the vampire with for the modern day vampire. I think without this work, we don't have Dracula. This is very clearly an influence on Dracula, as well as on later works in the realm of vampire fiction. This is truly the moment vampires become pop culture icons. So this is a really interesting work from that regard, but I will say I think it is the weakest of the three I have discussed here today. And it's hard to discuss it against poetry because that's not what Dr. Polidori was going for with this. He was going for a novella or a short story, but there is so much story packed into around 20 pages that it definitely, in my opinion, should have been a novel. It should have been given room to breathe. And then I think it would be really, and maybe the top 5 books of all time for me, because I loved the story. In fact, it really makes me want to sit down and write a retelling of it and give it some good fleshing out. But something that makes me feel better about it and makes me want to rate it a little bit more highly is that I really, really think this could be termed almost a fairy tale in its own right, or a folk tale in its own right, because it kind of works in that style. It's kind of written in that style of an older fairy tale to me, which makes it really, really intriguing. And I like thinking of it more as a folk tale or a fairy tale than of thinking of it as a short story, because I'm just not a big fan of short stories. But fairy tales typically have something they want you to take away from this. And I don't know that the Vampyre has that, but it does feel very scary. It does feel very atmospheric in the same way as a fairy tale. So I'm very torn on the Vampyre because I really appreciate what it did for vampires in general, since I love them. And I also really enjoyed the story. I just think it needed more room to breathe and it needed a longer page count. So I think in these three works, you can see some of the birth of the modern vampire. I think certainly the kind of hypnotism or the glamoring use of the word sire, the kind of handsome aristocrat moving about society. These are things that we now really associate with vampires. And I think we associate them with vampires because of Dracula. But it's interesting to see where perhaps Bram Stoker was looking for his own inspiration when he sat down to write Dracula. I highly recommend these, and I would love to know your thoughts on them if you have read these down below. And I would love to know too, what your favorite vampire story is and who your favorite vampire is. Tell me who your favorite vampire is down below. But that's gonna be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading, happy Halloween. Goodbye.